You know that moment when your entire world shifts on its axis and suddenly everything you thought you knew becomes a lie? Well, imagine sitting in your childhood living room, watching your husband review your parents' foreclosure papers, only to discover his business card matches their mortgage company. Imagine 3 years of family dinners where they treated him like he wasn't good enough, while he literally held the deed to their house. Imagine the silence when your father, who called your husband just a mechanic behind his back, realizes that same mechanic could make them homeless with a single phone call. That was my reality last month, and the aftermath changed everything about how I see love, family, and the dangerous assumptions we make about people based on appearances. My name is Jessica, and this is the story of how my family's prejudice nearly cost them everything, including me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Marie Vasquez. I'm 29 years old. And until 6 weeks ago, I believed my family was everything I could ask for in this world. We were the Vasquez clan of Westfield, Texas. The family everyone in our neighborhood looked up to and secretly envied. My parents, Roberto and Carmen Vasquez, built what everyone considered the perfect American dream from absolutely nothing. Dad worked his way up from a grocery store stock boy to regional manager of 3 H-E-B locations, while Mom transformed her love of cooking into Carmen's Kitchen, a catering business that handled every major celebration from Houston to San Antonio. Our house on Magnolia Drive was the heartbeat of our community. Every Sunday, the driveway overflowed with cars as 3 generations gathered around Mom's dining room table for her legendary barbacoa and homemade tortillas. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends, and neighbors all knew they had a standing invitation to join us. The laughter from our backyard quinceañera practice sessions and Dad's enthusiastic commentary during Astros games echoed through the entire neighborhood. We were the family that had made it, the success story that proved hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. For 29 years, I shaped my identity around being a Vasquez daughter. I understood the unspoken expectations that came with our family name. Education was sacred in our household, not just encouraged but demanded as the foundation for building something even greater than what my parents had achieved. My older brother Carlos earned his engineering degree from UT Austin and now designs infrastructure projects across Texas. My younger sister Elena became a pediatric nurse at Texas Children's Hospital, following Mom's dream of having a daughter in the medical field. I proudly carried on the tradition by earning my communications degree from Texas State and building a successful career in public relations for a firm in downtown Houston. But then I met Jake Mitchell, and suddenly, everything I thought I knew about love, family loyalty, and what truly matters in life began unraveling like a cheap sweater in a thunderstorm. The day that shattered my world started like any ordinary Thursday morning. I was sitting across from my parents in the same living room where I'd celebrated birthdays, graduation parties, and holiday mornings for nearly 3 decades. The afternoon sunlight streamed through Mom's meticulously maintained lace curtains, highlighting the family photos that covered every surface and the hand-carved wooden cross Dad brought back from their anniversary trip to Mexico. This room had always represented safety, unconditional love, and the certainty that my family would support me through anything life threw my way. Dad sat in his favorite recliner, the one Mom had reupholstered twice but refused to replace because it was where he read bedtime stories to all of us kids. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he squinted at a stack of official-looking documents spread across the coffee table. Mom paced behind the couch, her nervous energy filling the room as she twisted her wedding ring, a habit she'd developed during stressful moments throughout my childhood. The weight of their anxiety was suffocating, heavier than the Texas humidity that made our air conditioning work overtime even in October. 3 months earlier, Dad's world had crumbled when H-E-B Corporate announced massive restructuring that eliminated regional management positions. 23 years of dedicated service, perfect attendance records, and community involvement meant nothing when executives in San Antonio decided to streamline operations. Mom's catering business, which had thrived for 15 years on word-of-mouth recommendations and repeat customers, was simultaneously struggling against new competition from trendy Houston catering companies that charged half her prices and delivered Instagram-worthy presentations that made her traditional Mexican cuisine look outdated. The financial pressure had been building for months, but my proud parents kept their struggles hidden from their children until the situation became desperate. The mortgage on their beloved Magnolia Drive home, the place where 4 generations of our family had celebrated life's most important moments, was 3 months behind. Foreclosure notices had started arriving, each one more threatening than the last. The bank that had eagerly approved their loan during better times was now demanding immediate payment of $37,000, or they would lose everything. Jake had offered to review their paperwork, suggesting that maybe his business connections could help identify options they hadn't considered. My parents' desperation finally overcame their barely concealed disapproval of my boyfriend, the man they'd spent 2 years treating like an unwelcome guest at family gatherings. Dad had reluctantly agreed, admitting that they needed advice from someone who understood financial matters, even if that someone was just a mechanic who probably learned about money from fixing rich people's cars. I watched Jake's face as he carefully examined each document, his expression shifting from professional concentration to something I couldn't quite identify. His usually steady hands seemed to tremble slightly as he reached for his wallet and pulled out a crisp white business card. Without saying a word, he placed it on the coffee table next to Dad's mortgage papers. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a tornado touches down, when the air becomes so still and heavy that you know everything is about to change forever. The business cards were identical. Magnolia Financial Solutions, with Jake. Mitchell listed as Chief Executive Officer and Founder. The same company name that appeared at the top of every mortgage document, every payment coupon, every foreclosure notice that had been terrorizing my parents for months. My mother stopped pacing mid-step, her face draining of color as she stared at the cards. Dad removed his reading glasses and cleaned them twice, as if clarity would somehow change what he was seeing. "You own our mortgage?" Mom's voice came out as barely a whisper, the same tone she used when receiving news about family deaths or medical emergencies. Jake nodded slowly, his expression serious but impossibly gentle. "I've owned it for 18 months, he said quietly. "I purchased it from First National when they were selling off their residential loan portfolio to focus on commercial lending." The revelation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. For 2 years, my family had treated Jake with polite but unmistakable condescension. They'd questioned his ambitions, dismissed his opinions, and made countless subtle comments about my choice to date someone who worked with his hands instead of his mind. Dad had lectured me about the importance of marrying someone with professional prospects and long-term financial stability. Mom had expressed concerns about my future security with a man whose career had limited growth potential and whose background didn't align with Vasquez family values. Meanwhile, Jake had been quietly holding the deed to their home, the power to make their worst financial nightmare come true or to offer them the salvation they desperately needed. He'd endured their subtle insults, their pointed questions about his education and career plans, their obvious disappointment in my choice of partner, all while knowing he could resolve their financial crisis with a single phone call. The irony was so profound, it felt like a cosmic joke designed specifically to humble my family's pride and expose the hollowness of their social prejudices. But what devastated me even more than the shocking revelation was the sudden clarity about who Jake really was versus who I'd allowed my family to convince me he might be. For months, I'd been making excuses for their behavior while secretly wondering if their concerns about our relationship had merit. I'd questioned whether I was settling for less than I deserved, whether love was enough to overcome practical considerations about financial compatibility and social expectations. I'd allowed their doubt to creep into my mind like poison, slowly, eroding my confidence in my own judgment and my trust in Jake's character. Now, sitting in that sunlit living room surrounded by 3 decades of family memories, I realized that Jake had never been the problem. The man I'd fallen in love with at my friend's birthday party 2 years ago, the one who made me laugh until my sides hurt and listened to my work complaints with genuine interest, the one who remembered my coffee order and surprised me with thoughtful gestures that had nothing to do with money, had been exactly who he appeared to be from the very beginning. I was the one who'd allowed external voices to overshadow my internal knowing. I was the one who'd let family pressure make me question the most authentic love I'd ever experienced. The shame that washed over me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Not shame about Jake or our relationship, but crushing shame about my own weakness, my willingness to prioritize family approval over personal happiness, my failure to defend the man I claimed to love against people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered more than my own heart. I had been so busy trying to bridge the gap between Jake and my family that I'd forgotten to trust the person who knew both of them best, myself. As Jake calmly began explaining payment modification options to my stunned parents, treating them with the same respectful kindness he'd shown despite years of their disrespect, I excused myself to the bathroom and broke down completely. The tears came in waves, each one carrying a different realization about how wrong I'd been, how much pain I'd allowed my family to inflict on someone who deserved nothing but my unwavering support. I sobbed for the family dinners where I'd sat, silent while they made subtle digs about Jake's future prospects. I cried for the times I'd apologized to him afterward instead of confronting their behavior in the moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wept for every doubt I'd entertained about our relationship based on their narrow-minded expectations instead of trusting what I knew to be true about Jake's character. When I finally returned to the living room, I found Jake patiently walking my parents through refinancing options that would not only save their house, but actually reduce their monthly payments. He was explaining concepts like equity protection and interest rate modification with the expertise of someone who'd spent years helping families navigate financial crises. His voice carried the authority of genuine knowledge combined with the compassion of someone who understood that homes represent more than just financial investments. They're the foundation of family legacy and emotional security. Mom was taking notes in her careful handwriting, asking questions about payment schedules and processing times. Dad was nodding along, his earlier skepticism replaced by grudging respect for Jake's obvious expertise and professionalism. Neither of them was acknowledging the years of condescension they'd shown Jake, but both were clearly beginning to understand that they'd misjudged him so completely that their error bordered on the absurd. That night, lying in bed next to Jake, in our apartment, I finally asked the question that had been burning in my mind since the afternoon's revelation. Why didn't you ever tell me about your business? Why did you let my family treat you like you weren't successful enough for me? His answer revealed depths of character I was still discovering after 2 years together. Because their approval isn't what makes our relationship real, he said simply. I didn't need to prove anything to them to know what we have together. And honestly, I wanted to see if you'd choose us even when it felt difficult, even when the people you love were making it hard. Real love doesn't depend on external validation or social status. It's about 2 people deciding they're better together than apart, regardless of what anyone else thinks. His words hit me like a revelation. While I'd been struggling to make him acceptable to my family, he'd been quietly testing whether I'd choose our relationship over their approval. While I'd been worried about their judgment of his worthiness, he'd been evaluating my commitment to us independent of outside pressure. The man I'd been trying to defend had never needed defending. He'd been strong enough to withstand their criticism because he was secure in his own value and confident in our connection. But Jake's patience and understanding only highlighted my own failure more starkly. I'd spent 2 years being embarrassed by their treatment of him instead of being embarrassed by my tolerance of that treatment. I'd focused on managing their disapproval instead of establishing boundaries that protected our relationship from their interference. I'd been so concerned with maintaining family harmony that I'd sacrificed the peace and security of the person who should have been my top priority. The mortgage revelation forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself and my family that I'd been avoiding for years. We weren't the perfectly loving, unconditionally supportive clan I'd always believed us to be. We were capable of cruel judgment based on superficial characteristics. We could be snobbish, narrow-minded, and hurtful when people didn't meet our predetermined standards. And I had been complicit in that behavior by failing to challenge it when it targeted someone I loved. More importantly, I realized that my desire for family approval had been slowly poisoning my relationship with Jake from the inside. Every family gathering where they treated him poorly chipped away at my confidence in us. Every subtle criticism made me question my own judgment. Every expression of disappointment about my choice made me wonder if I was making a mistake. I'd been allowing their voices to become louder than my own inner wisdom, their values to override my personal experience, their fears to eclipse my happiness. The irony was devastating. While my family had been worried about Jake's ability to provide financial security for our future, he'd been the one with the power to secure or destroy their financial present. While they'd been concerned about his limited education and professional prospects, he'd been running a successful business that helped families avoid the exact crisis they were facing. While they'd been judging him based on his appearance and job title, he'd been demonstrating the kind of character and integrity they claimed to value above all else. But perhaps the most painful realization was that I'd allowed their prejudices to make me doubt my own instincts about love. From our first conversation at that birthday party, I'd known Jake was special. The way he listened with complete attention, asked thoughtful questions, and made me feel like the most interesting person in the room had been unlike anything I'd experienced with previous boyfriends. Our connection felt effortless and authentic in a way that made me understand why people write songs about finding the one. Yet instead of trusting that instinct and protecting it fiercely, I'd let external opinions make me second-guess what I knew to be true. I'd spent energy trying to change my family's perception of Jake instead of changing my response to their inappropriate behavior. I'd invested in managing their disappointment instead of investing in strengthening our relationship against outside interference. As I lay there processing the day's events, I made a decision that would fundamentally change how I approached both family relationships and romantic partnership going forward. I would never again allow anyone, no matter how much I loved them or how much their opinion traditionally mattered to me, to make me question my own emotional intelligence. I would trust my ability to evaluate people's character based on how they treated me and others, not on their job titles or social status. I would defend my choices and my partner with the same fierce loyalty I expected from them. Most importantly, I would never again prioritize family harmony over personal happiness when those two things came into conflict. Love from family members who couldn't accept the person I'd chosen to build my life with wasn't really love at all. It was conditional approval based on my willingness to conform to their expectations rather than follow my own heart. The mortgage revelation had shattered my understanding of my family, my relationship, and myself in ways that felt simultaneously devastating and liberating. Like an earthquake that destroys unstable foundations but reveals solid bedrock underneath, this crisis had exposed painful truths while creating space for more authentic connections to develop. The question now was whether my family could learn to see Jake for who he really was, and whether I could learn to trust myself enough to never let outside voices override my inner knowing again. Growing up in Westfield, Texas, the Vasquez family represented everything our Latino community aspired to achieve in America. Our neighborhood of Oak Ridge Estates was filled with families who had worked their way up from Houston's East End, transforming their children's lives through education, determination, and an unwavering belief that success was measured by how far you could climb above your starting point. Every house on Magnolia Drive told a similar story of immigration, struggle, and eventual prosperity, But ours was the crown jewel that proved the American dream was still attainable for those willing to sacrifice everything for it. Dad's journey from teenage grocery store clerk to regional manager of 3 H-E-B locations was legendary in our community. He'd arrived from Guadalajara at 17 with nothing but a work ethic that bordered on obsessive and a determination to build something lasting for the family he hoped to create someday. Mom's transformation from a young woman who could barely speak English to the owner of Carmen's Kitchen, the most sought-after catering service in 3 counties, was equally inspiring. Together, they'd built not just financial success but social standing that made other families point to us as proof that hard work could overcome any obstacle. Our house on Magnolia Drive was more than just a residence. It was a testament to everything they'd accomplished and a gathering place for everyone who shared their values. The sprawling ranch-style home with its perfectly manicured lawn and Mom's prize-winning rose garden represented stability, prosperity, and the kind of life they'd dreamed about during those early years when Dad worked double shifts and Mom cleaned office buildings at night to pay for her catering equipment. Every detail was carefully chosen to project success. From Dad's restored 1969 Camaro in the driveway to the hand-carved wooden furniture Mom had custom-made by artisans in San Antonio. Sunday dinners at our house were community events that drew extended family, neighbors, and friends from across Houston. Mom would spend days preparing traditional dishes that had been passed down through generations, filling our dining room with the aromas of homemade mole, fresh tortillas, and the barbacoa that made her famous throughout Texas. The conversations around our table were conducted in a mixture of Spanish and English, moving seamlessly between discussions of children's achievements, business opportunities, and community, news that connected us to families scattered across the state. Dad presided over these gatherings like a benevolent patriarch, sharing stories about his latest business successes, while encouraging younger family members to pursue their educational goals with the same intensity that had defined his own climb to prosperity. Mom moved between kitchen and dining room with effortless grace, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and fed while simultaneously managing the logistics of serving 30 people with the precision that made her catering business so successful. These weekly celebrations reinforced our family's position as community leaders and demonstrated the kind of life that was possible for those who honored tradition while embracing American opportunities. The respect our family commanded in Westfield went beyond financial success to encompass social influence that shaped community standards and expectations. Dad served on the school board and coached Little League Baseball, using his position to advocate for programs that would benefit Latino children throughout the district. Mom organized fundraisers for the local Catholic Church and coordinated cultural celebrations that brought together families from across Houston's sprawling Latino communities. Their involvement in civic activities wasn't just about giving back. It was about establishing themselves as the kind of people whose opinions mattered and whose approval carried weight in decisions affecting the entire neighborhood. Our house became the unofficial headquarters for planning quinceañeras, graduation parties, and wedding celebrations that brought together hundreds of people from interconnected family networks spanning generations. Mom's reputation for creating magical events that honored tradition while incorporating modern elegance made Carmen's Kitchen the gold standard for important celebrations. Families would book her services years in advance, knowing that having Carmen Vasquez cater your event was a mark of distinction that elevated your family's social standing within the community. The success Dad achieved at H-E-B extended far beyond his official job responsibilities to encompass mentoring relationships with younger Latino employees who looked to him as proof that advancement was possible within corporate America. His office walls were covered with photos from store openings, employee recognition ceremonies, and community events where he represented the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Regional executives relied on his insights about Latino consumer preferences and his ability to connect with community leaders who could influence shopping patterns across South Texas. This combination of financial prosperity, social influence, and community respect created an environment where the Vasquez family name carried expectations that shaped every aspect of our lives. Education wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory, with the understanding that each generation was responsible for building upon the foundation established by our parents' sacrifices. Career choices weren't simply personal decisions. They reflected the family's values and commitment to continued upward mobility that honored the struggles of those who came before us. The pressure to maintain our family's reputation influenced everything from the clothes we wore to the friends we brought home, the activities we participated in, and ultimately the people we chose to love. Success was defined not just by personal happiness, but by external recognition that validated our family's position within the complex social hierarchy of our community. Other families looked to us as an example of what was possible, and that visibility came with responsibilities that sometimes felt heavier than the benefits they provided. My childhood was filled with constant reminders of how fortunate I was to be born into a family that had achieved so much while maintaining strong cultural connections and traditional values. Extended family members would point to our house, our parents' businesses, and our educational achievements as evidence that the Vasquez family had found the perfect balance between honoring our Mexican heritage and embracing American opportunities. This recognition was simultaneously a source of pride and a burden that shaped my understanding of what love and acceptance required. The illusion of perfection that surrounded our family was so complete that even I believed it for most of my life. The occasional tensions that arose during family gatherings were dismissed as minor disagreements rather than signs of deeper issues with judgment and acceptance. The subtle pressure to conform to predetermined standards felt normal because it was packaged as caring guidance from people who wanted the best for me. The expectation that my choices would reflect family values seemed reasonable because those values had produced such obvious success for previous generations. When neighbors complimented my parents on raising such accomplished children, when relatives bragged about our family's achievements at social gatherings, when community leaders sought Dad's advice on business matters and Mom's expertise on event planning, it reinforced the narrative that we had achieved something special that needed to be protected and maintained. The golden illusion wasn't just about external perceptions. It was about our own belief that we had created a life so valuable that preserving it justified almost any sacrifice. This carefully constructed image of family success and harmony became the lens through which I evaluated potential romantic partners, career opportunities, and personal goals throughout my 20s. The question wasn't whether something made me happy, but whether it enhanced or threatened the reputation my parents had spent decades building. The golden illusion demanded that every choice contribute to the family's continued upward trajectory, and anything that might be perceived as moving backward was automatically suspect. The rules governing acceptable behavior in the Vasquez household were never written down or explicitly stated, but they were as binding as any legal contract and far more pervasive in their influence over our daily lives. These invisible chains were forged from expectations that had been refined over decades of climbing the social and economic ladder, and they wrapped around every aspect of our existence with a subtlety that made them nearly impossible to recognize until you tried to move in a direction they didn't allow. Education was the first and most fundamental chain, but it extended far beyond simply attending college to encompass specific types of learning that were deemed acceptable for a family of our standing. Carlos had chosen engineering because it was practical, well-respected, and offered clear pathways to financial success that would enhance the family's reputation for producing accomplished children. Elena's decision to become a pediatric nurse satisfied multiple requirements simultaneously, combining the prestige of healthcare with the traditional expectation that women should work in nurturing professions that complemented rather than competed with male achievements. My communications degree had been carefully selected after extensive family discussions about careers that would be suitable for the youngest Vasquez daughter. Teaching was considered too limiting in terms of financial potential. Law was deemed too aggressive for a woman who would eventually need to balance career and family responsibilities. Medicine required too many years of education that would delay marriage and childbearing beyond the optimal timeframe. Communications offered the perfect combination of professional respectability, creative expression, and flexibility that would allow me to support a husband's career while maintaining my own identity. The selection of romantic partners operated under an even more complex set of unspoken criteria that evaluated potential boyfriends across multiple dimensions of compatibility with family values and social standing. Education level was paramount, with college graduation serving as the minimum acceptable threshold and graduate degrees preferred for serious relationships that might lead to marriage. Professional prospects were scrutinized with the intensity of a corporate hiring committee, focusing not just on current income, but on long-term earning potential and social status within the broader community. Cultural background played a significant role in determining acceptability, with Latino heritage strongly preferred, but not absolutely required if other qualifications were sufficiently impressive. Family stability was assessed through careful observation of how potential partners interacted with their own relatives, spoke about their upbringing, and demonstrated respect for authority figures and traditional values. Personal character was evaluated based on manners, dress, conversation skills, and the indefinable quality of whether someone fit with the Vasquez family's image of itself. Religious compatibility was another invisible chain that bound our romantic choices, with active Catholic participation strongly encouraged, and atheism or alternative spiritual practices viewed as potential sources of conflict that could undermine family unity. Political views were expected to align with conservative positions on family values, while supporting progressive policies that benefited Latino communities, creating a complex ideological framework that required careful navigation during family discussions about current events and social issues. The chain of financial responsibility operated through subtle but persistent pressure to make career and relationship decisions that would enhance rather than burden the family's economic position. This didn't mean explicitly asking for money or support, but rather choosing paths that demonstrated fiscal responsibility and long-term planning that honored the sacrifices previous generations had made to create opportunities for education and advancement. Failure to achieve financial independence by a certain age was seen as a reflection of poor character rather than bad luck or economic circumstances beyond individual control. Geographic proximity was another invisible chain that bound us to the Houston area through expectations about maintaining close family relationships and participating in the extended network of social and cultural activities that defined our community identity. Moving away for career opportunities was acceptable temporarily, but permanent relocation was discouraged through subtle expressions of disappointment and frequent reminders about the importance of staying connected to family roots and cultural heritage. Social behavior was governed by invisible chains that required constant attention to how our actions reflected on the family name and reputation within the community. Public intoxication, legal troubles, financial difficulties, or relationship drama that became visible to neighbors or extended family members were treated as betrayals of trust that threatened everyone's standing within the complex social hierarchy of our neighborhood. The pressure to maintain appearances extended to everything from lawn maintenance and car cleanliness to appropriate dress for church services and community events. The most insidious invisible chain was the expectation of gratitude that made questioning family decisions or expressing disagreement with established values seem like ingratitude for the opportunities and advantages we'd been given. This psychological manipulation was so skillfully applied that it rarely felt overtly controlling, instead manifesting as gentle reminders about how fortunate we were to have parents who cared enough to guide our choices and protect us from mistakes that could derail our promising futures. Career advancement was chained to family expectations through subtle pressure to choose positions and companies that enhanced the Vasquez family's reputation for producing successful children who honored their upbringing. This meant prioritizing prestigious employers over smaller companies that might offer better working conditions, selecting roles that were easily explained to relatives over opportunities that required complex descriptions of responsibilities and goals, and maintaining professional relationships that could benefit the entire family's network of business and social connections. The chain of emotional expression required us to display enthusiasm for family gatherings, appreciation for parental guidance, and loyalty to family decisions even when they conflicted with personal preferences or individual judgment. Criticism of family members, especially parents, was treated as dangerous behavior that threatened the unity and harmony that had been so carefully cultivated over decades of building our reputation within the community. Marriage expectations were bound by invisible chains that evaluated potential spouses not just as individual partners, but as additions to the extended Vasquez family network who would need to integrate seamlessly into existing social and cultural patterns. This meant considering how a future husband would interact with dad during Sunday dinners, whether he would appreciate mom's cooking and cultural traditions, and how well he would represent the family's values during community events and social gatherings. The most devastating aspect of these invisible chains was how completely they were internalized as expressions of love and protection rather than mechanisms of control and limitation. The restrictions felt reasonable because they were presented as guidance from people who wanted the best for us, wisdom gained from years of experience navigating the challenges of building success in a society that didn't always welcome Latino families with open arms. By the time I reached adulthood, these invisible chains had become so much a part of my identity that I couldn't imagine making important decisions without considering how they would affect my family's reputation and my own standing within the carefully constructed hierarchy of community approval. The chains didn't feel restrictive because I had never known life without them, and they were reinforced constantly through subtle rewards for compliance and gentle consequences for deviation from established expectations. The morning after Jake's mortgage revelation, I found myself standing in the walk-in closet of our apartment, staring at a stack of journals I'd been keeping since I was 15 years old. These leather-bound books, each one carefully selected and purchased with my own money, represented something I'd never shared with anyone, not even Jake, during our 2 years together. They were my secret documentation of a relationship with my family that I'd never been able to fully understand or articulate, a private record of moments that felt significant, but that I couldn't discuss with anyone who might judge my family or question my loyalty to them. The journal keeping had started during my sophomore year of high school, initially as a way to process the complicated emotions that arose during family gatherings and important decisions about my future. What began as simple diary entries about daily events gradually evolved into detailed documentation of patterns I was only beginning to recognize, conversations that left me feeling confused or hurt in ways I couldn't explain, and observations about the difference between what my family said they valued and how they actually treated people in real life. My first journal was filled with entries about college selection, recording the subtle pressure I felt to choose schools and majors that would enhance the family's reputation, rather than following my own interests and passions. I wrote about the anxiety that arose when I expressed interest in studying art or creative writing, how those suggestions were dismissed with gentle but firm explanations about the importance of practical career choices that would provide financial security and social respectability. The entries documented my gradual acceptance of communications as a compromise that satisfied family expectations while allowing some creative expression within acceptable boundaries. The journals chronicled my evolving understanding of how romantic relationships were evaluated within my family's value system, recording conversations where potential boyfriends were discussed and analyzed according to criteria that seemed to have nothing to do with my happiness or emotional connection. I wrote about the praise Marcus received when I brought him home during my junior year of college, how his pre-law studies and family background earned immediate approval that made family dinners feel relaxed and celebratory. The contrast was stark when I documented the polite but distant reception given to David, the art student I dated briefly, whose creative passion and unconventional appearance seemed to make everyone uncomfortable, despite his intelligence and kindness. Page after page captured the subtle dynamics that shaped family interactions, the way certain topics were encouraged while others were quietly discouraged, how achievements were celebrated when they aligned with family values, but minimized when they represented personal growth that might threaten established hierarchies. I recorded conversations where my opinions were solicited but ultimately dismissed if they contradicted predetermined conclusions, where my emotional responses to family decisions were treated as temporary immaturity rather than valid perspectives. That deserved consideration. The most revealing entries focused on the difference between how my family presented itself to the outside world and how members treated each other when no one else was watching. I documented the careful choreography of Sunday dinners, how seating arrangements and conversation topics were managed to create specific impressions, how certain family members were encouraged to share particular stories while others were subtly discouraged from mentioning experiences that might complicate the narrative of universal success and happiness. My journals became repositories for observations about the unspoken rules that governed family relationships, recording instances where love seemed to be conditional on compliance with expectations rather than offered freely regardless of individual choices. I wrote about the subtle disappointment that followed decisions that prioritized personal fulfillment over family approval, how emotional support was readily available for struggles that were deemed acceptable but withheld when challenges arose from choices that had been discouraged or criticized. The documentation process revealed patterns that would have been invisible if I hadn't been recording them consistently over years. Individual incidents that seemed like minor disagreements or temporary tensions began to form clear pictures of systematic expectations and consequences that shaped every aspect of family relationships. The journals showed me how persuasive the family's narrative about love and protection could be when I wasn't paying careful attention to the actual dynamics underlying our interactions. One of the most significant patterns documented in my journals was the way family members were expected to subordinate individual judgment to collective wisdom, how personal instincts about people and situations were consistently overruled by family assessments based on criteria that seemed to prioritize external perception over internal truth. I recorded numerous instances where my initial impressions of people were proven correct, while family evaluations based on superficial characteristics led to misunderstandings and missed opportunities for genuine connection. The journals documented my growing awareness of how class and educational prejudices influenced family relationships, recording conversations where people were dismissed or embraced based on job titles, income levels, and social status rather than character, intelligence, or compatibility. These entries revealed a pattern of judgment that contradicted the family's stated values about treating everyone with respect and dignity, showing instead a systematic preference for people whose achievements validated the family's own climb up the socioeconomic ladder. My documentation captured the emotional cost of maintaining family harmony while suppressing personal authenticity, recording the physical symptoms that accompanied family gatherings where I felt unable to express honest opinions or defend people who were being unfairly criticized. I wrote about headaches that developed during conversations where I wanted to speak up but feared creating conflict, stomach problems that arose when I witnessed family members treating others poorly while expecting me to remain silent and supportive. The most painful entries documented my gradual loss of confidence in my own judgment as family pressure influenced my evaluation of romantic relationships, career opportunities, and personal goals. I recorded the internal conflict that arose when my instincts about people and situations contradicted family assessments, how I learned to doubt my own perceptions rather than question their authority on matters they claimed to understand better than I did. The journals became evidence of how gradually and skillfully family expectations had been internalized as my own values, documenting the process by which external pressure transformed into self-imposed limitations that felt like personal choices rather than compliance with unspoken demands. The entries showed how completely I had accepted the premise that family approval was necessary for personal happiness, that individual fulfillment was selfish if it conflicted with collective harmony. Reading through years of documentation after Jake's revelation was like discovering archaeological evidence of my own psychological development, seeing clearly for the first time how patterns of control and manipulation had been disguised as love and protection. The journals revealed the systematic erosion of my confidence in personal judgment, the gradual acceptance of family authority over individual autonomy, and the internalization of values that prioritized external validation over internal authenticity. The most shocking discovery was how consistently the documentation revealed my family's capacity for misjudging people based on superficial characteristics, while claiming to value deeper qualities like character, integrity, and kindness. Entry after entry recorded instances where family members dismissed or criticized individuals who were later proven to possess exactly the qualities they claimed to admire, while embracing people whose impressive credentials masked significant character flaws that became apparent only after causing substantial damage. The weeks following Jake's first awkward introduction to my family marked the beginning of a psychological descent that I wouldn't fully understand until much later, when the mortgage revelation forced me to examine my own complicity in the dysfunction that had poisoned our relationship from the very beginning. What started as making excuses for my family's behavior gradually transformed into questioning my own judgment, defending their concerns as reasonable while wondering if maybe I was the one who couldn't see the situation clearly. The process began subtly, with small concessions to their perspective that seemed harmless at the time, but created momentum toward increasingly significant betrayals of my own instincts about Jake's character. When Mom mentioned that Jake seemed quiet during Sunday dinner, I found myself explaining that he was probably just nervous about making a good impression, rather than acknowledging that her definition of acceptable conversation seemed to require him to perform enthusiasm for topics that clearly didn't interest him. When Dad questioned Jake's long-term prospects in the automotive industry, I caught myself researching career advancement opportunities for mechanics, instead of challenging the assumption that working with your hands was inherently less valuable than pushing papers behind a desk. The research became a form of self-torture, as I tried to find evidence that Jake's chosen profession could lead to the kind of financial success that would satisfy my family's standards for social mobility and economic stability. The spiral deepened when I started anticipating family criticism and attempting to address their concerns before they were explicitly stated, a process that required me to view Jake through increasingly critical eyes that focused on potential weaknesses rather than celebrating his obvious strengths. I found myself noticing things that had never bothered me before. How his work clothes smelled like motor oil even after washing. How his hands bore permanent stains from years of mechanical work. How his conversation style was more listening-focused than the verbose storytelling that dominated Vasquez family gatherings. The most insidious aspect of the self-blame spiral was how it transformed my understanding of what love should require, making me believe that questioning my family's judgment was a betrayal of their care and concern, rather than a necessary defense of my own emotional well-being. I began to interpret their criticism of Jake as evidence of how much they loved me, reasoning that people who didn't care wouldn't invest so much energy in trying to protect me from making mistakes that could derail my promising future. This rationalization required increasingly creative mental gymnastics as their behavior toward Jake became more obviously inappropriate and hurtful. When they seated him at the far end of the table during family gatherings, I told myself they were just trying to include more family members in conversations rather than acknowledging that they were deliberately marginalizing him. When they consistently forgot to ask about his work or interests while showing enthusiastic interest in other guests' careers and hobbies, I convinced myself that they were just more comfortable with familiar topics rather than admitting that they were systematically excluding him from family bonding rituals. The psychological pressure of maintaining these rationalizations while witnessing Jake's quiet dignity in the face of their treatment created physical symptoms that I initially attributed to work stress or minor health issues, rather than recognizing them as manifestations of the cognitive dissonance between what I was observing and what I was forcing myself to believe. Headaches became frequent companions to family gatherings, arriving reliably whenever I found myself torn between defending Jake and maintaining family harmony. Sleep disturbances developed as my subconscious mind struggled to process the contradiction between my family's stated values about treating everyone with respect and their actual behavior toward the man I loved. I would lie awake replaying conversations, searching for interpretations that would allow me to believe both that my family was fundamentally good and that their treatment of Jake was somehow justifiable or at least understandable given their legitimate concerns about my future happiness. The spiral accelerated when I began modifying my own behavior to minimize conflict between Jake and my family, a process that required me to become increasingly dishonest with both sides about my true feelings and observations. I started suggesting that Jake might be more comfortable staying home from certain family events, framing this as consideration for his schedule rather than admitting that I was protecting him from their continued rejection and protecting myself from the emotional exhaustion of managing their interactions. With Jake, I found myself downplaying incidents that had hurt or angered me, describing family members' behavior in the most charitable terms possible, while asking him to understand that they meant well even when their actions suggested otherwise. I became an expert at translation, explaining that Dad's questions about his career plans were expressions of fatherly concern, rather than implicit criticism of his current choices, that Mom's suggestions about his appearance were helpful advice, rather than attempts to transform him into someone more acceptable to their social circle. The most damaging aspect of the self-blame spiral was how it gradually eroded my confidence in my own ability to evaluate people and situations accurately, making me dependent on family validation for decisions that should have been based on personal experience and individual judgment. I began second-guessing instincts that had served me well throughout my life, questioning whether my love for Jake was based on realistic assessment of his qualities or naive romanticism that prevented me from seeing obvious problems with our compatibility. This self-doubt extended beyond my relationship with Jake to encompass broader questions about my maturity, intelligence, and capacity for making sound decisions about my future. I started viewing my family's concerns as evidence of wisdom and experience that I lacked, reasoning that people who had successfully built careers and maintained marriages obviously understood relationship dynamics better than someone who had never faced the challenges of long-term commitment and financial responsibility. The spiral reached its deepest point when I began to believe that my family's criticism of Jake was actually a reflection of my own shortcomings as a partner and daughter, that their disappointment was justified because I had failed to choose someone who would enhance our family's reputation and social standing. I convinced myself that their rejection of Jake was really rejection of my poor judgment, that their concerns about our relationship were actually concerns about my ability to make decisions that honored the sacrifices they had made to provide me with opportunities for success and happiness. This twisted logic led me to work even harder to prove that I was worthy of their approval by attempting to transform Jake into someone they could accept, a project that required me to view him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved unconditionally. I found myself making subtle suggestions about his appearance, encouraging him to share more about his business interests during family gatherings, and coaching him on conversation topics that might help him connect with my parents and siblings. The most painful realization, which wouldn't come until much later, was how completely I had abandoned Jake during his most vulnerable moments with my family, choosing to protect their feelings and maintain family harmony, rather than standing up for the person who should have been my highest priority. I had become an enabler of their inappropriate behavior, providing them with justifications for their treatment of Jake, while denying him the support and defense he deserved from someone who claimed to love him. The self-blame spiral created a prison of my own construction, where every attempt to escape by defending Jake or challenging family assumptions was immediately countered by guilt about being disloyal to people who had given me everything and only wanted the best for my future. The psychological exhaustion of maintaining this impossible balance between competing loyalties left me depleted and confused, unable to see clearly how completely I had betrayed both Jake and myself in service of preserving an illusion of family, harmony that was already irreparably damaged. Moving in with Jake after 18 months of dating felt like stepping into an alternate universe where my thoughts, feelings, and daily experiences actually mattered to someone who shared my living space. Our modest two-bedroom apartment in downtown Houston's Museum District became a sanctuary where I could exist without constantly measuring my words against invisible family standards, or anticipating criticism of choices that felt natural and authentic when I was away from Magnolia Drive. The apartment itself was nothing spectacular by Vasquez family standards. A converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls, industrial fixtures, and windows that looked out over the bustling energy of a neighborhood filled with young professionals, artists, and graduate students who were building their lives without the weight of generational expectations pressing down on every decision. Jake had chosen the location specifically because it was equidistant from his shop in the Heights and my public relations firm near downtown. A practical decision that reflected his approach to most aspects of our shared life. The furniture was an eclectic mixture of pieces Jake had restored himself and items we'd chosen together during weekend trips to antique stores and estate sales throughout Southeast Texas. Unlike the carefully coordinated interior design of my childhood home, where every piece was selected to project specific messages about success and cultural sophistication, our apartment reflected our actual interests and lifestyle rather than attempting to impress visitors or maintain particular social appearances. Jake's presence in my daily routine created a stark contrast to the emotional exhaustion that had become my normal state during family interactions. He listened when I talked about work challenges without immediately offering solutions or judgments about whether my problems stemmed from insufficient effort or poor decision-making. He remembered details about my colleagues, asked follow-up questions about projects I was passionate about, and celebrated my professional achievements without analyzing whether they enhanced or threatened our relationship dynamic. The quality of attention Jake gave to my everyday experiences was unlike anything I had encountered in previous relationships or family interactions. When I complained about difficult clients or unreasonable deadlines, he focused on understanding how these situations affected me, rather than lecturing about the importance of maintaining professional relationships, or suggesting that my stress indicated weakness or inadequate preparation. His responses validated my emotional reactions while offering practical support that helped me navigate workplace challenges more effectively. Our morning conversations over coffee became daily rituals that reinforced my sense of being genuinely known and appreciated for who I actually was, rather than who I might become if I made better choices or worked harder to fulfill my potential. Jake noticed when I was excited about creative projects, when I was frustrated with administrative tasks, and when I was avoiding calls from family members who had opinions about aspects of my life that seemed perfectly manageable when I wasn't, defending them to people who hadn't been consulted about my decisions. The domestic routines we developed together revealed how profoundly different life could be when shared with someone who viewed partnership as mutual support rather than constant evaluation and improvement. Jake cooked elaborate weekend breakfasts without expecting praise or gratitude for his efforts, cleaned the apartment without maintaining mental scorecards about household contribution equality, and planned surprise outings based on interests I had mentioned casually rather than activities designed to demonstrate his thoughtfulness or enhance our social status. These ordinary moments of consideration and compatibility highlighted the toxic dynamics that had characterized my family relationships throughout my adult life, showing me what it felt like to be loved for existing rather than for achieving, to be supported without conditions, and to be trusted to make decisions about my own life without requiring approval or validation from people who claimed to know what was best for my future happiness. The contrast became especially pronounced when work colleagues met Jake during company events and social gatherings. My supervisor, Linda, who had observed my stress levels during periods of family conflict, commented repeatedly on how relaxed and confident I seemed when Jake was present. "You light up when he walks into a room," she observed during our holiday party. I've never seen anyone look at their partner the way he looks at you, like you're the most fascinating person he's ever met." These outside observations from people who had no investment in our relationship beyond professional courtesy provided validation that my instincts about Jake's character were accurate and that the connection we shared was visible to others who interacted with us in neutral settings. Colleagues who had heard me mention family concerns about our relationship expressed confusion about their objections, unable to understand how anyone could find fault with someone who was obviously devoted, respectful, and genuinely interested in supporting my personal and professional goals. The apartment became a space where I could explore aspects of my personality that had been suppressed or discouraged during family gatherings, where different perspectives were welcomed rather than corrected, where disagreements were resolved through discussion rather than submission to established authority. Jake encouraged me to pursue interests that my family had dismissed as impractical or self-indulgent, supporting my decision to take photography classes and explore freelance, writing opportunities that aligned with my creative instincts, rather than focusing exclusively on traditional career advancement. This encouragement of personal growth and creative expression created a positive feedback loop that strengthened my confidence in making independent decisions while deepening my appreciation for Jake's approach to partnership. Unlike family members, who offered support contingent on approval of my choices, Jake's encouragement was consistent regardless of whether my interests aligned with his own preferences or contributed to goals he understood or valued personally. The most significant difference between life with Jake and life under family scrutiny was the absence of performance pressure that had characterized most of my important relationships throughout my 20s. I didn't need to maintain particular energy levels, express appropriate levels of gratitude, or demonstrate ongoing progress toward predetermined goals in order to sustain his interest and affection. His love felt steady and reliable in ways that family approval never had, creating emotional security that allowed me to focus on personal growth rather than constantly managing external perceptions. However, this sanctuary from family expectations also became a source of internal conflict as I struggled to reconcile the happiness and authenticity I experienced with Jake against the growing concern and disappointment my family expressed about our relationship. The apartment that felt like home when we were alone together became a symbol of my defiance and poor judgment when viewed through the lens of family values and long-term planning that prioritized social status and financial security over emotional compatibility. The echo chamber effect became particularly pronounced when family members visited our apartment, their barely concealed criticism of our neighborhood, furniture choices, and lifestyle decisions creating an uncomfortable atmosphere that made Jake withdraw into polite formality while I found myself apologizing for aspects of our life that had felt perfectly satisfactory before being subjected to their evaluation. These visits highlighted how completely I had been living in two separate worlds, each with its own standards for success and happiness. The stress of maintaining these dual identities began manifesting in physical symptoms that I initially attributed to work pressure or seasonal changes, rather than recognizing them as consequences of the psychological strain created by loving someone my family couldn't accept. Insomnia became a regular problem, especially after family gatherings or phone conversations where Jake's inadequacies were discussed with the clinical detachment my family applied to all problems that required practical solutions. My appetite fluctuated wildly depending on whether I was anticipating family interactions or recovering from them, creating patterns of emotional eating and restriction that reflected the internal chaos caused by trying to honor conflicting loyalties. The woman who felt confident and capable when making decisions with Jake's support became anxious and indecisive when those same choices were subjected to family analysis and criticism. The most painful aspect of the echo chamber effect was recognizing how much energy I was investing in defending and explaining my relationship to people whose approval seemed increasingly irrelevant to my actual happiness and well-being. The hours spent crafting careful responses to family concerns, researching evidence that might address their objections, and attempting to translate Jake's qualities into language they would find impressive were hours stolen from building the relationship they were supposedly trying to protect. Jake never directly criticized my family or demanded that I choose between him and their approval. But his quiet patience during this period of internal conflict spoke volumes about his character and his commitment to our relationship. He understood that my struggle to reconcile competing loyalties was a necessary part of my personal growth, even when the process created temporary distance between us and subjected him to continued rejection from people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered more than my own experience of his love and support. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of every family gathering finally reached a boiling point during Elena's engagement celebration, an elaborate backyard party that Mom had been planning for 3 months with the same meticulous attention to detail that made Carmen's Kitchen the premier catering service in Southeast Texas. The event was designed to showcase not just Elena's happiness, but the Vasquez family's continued success in raising children who made appropriate life choices that enhanced rather than threatened their carefully cultivated reputation within the community. Elena's fiancé, Marcus Herrera, represented everything my family valued in a potential son-in-law. His pediatric residency at Texas Children's Hospital aligned perfectly with Elena's nursing career, creating a power couple that would dominate Houston's medical community while maintaining strong cultural connections and traditional family values. Marcus's family owned successful restaurants throughout the Rio Grande Valley, providing both financial security and social standing that complemented rather than competed with Dad's achievements in retail management and Mom's catering empire. The guest list for the engagement party read like a directory of Houston's most influential Latino families, including business owners, medical professionals, educators, and community leaders whose presence validated the Vasquez family's position within the complex social hierarchy that governed our neighborhood and extended cultural network. These were people who had watched our families rise from working-class immigrants to upper-middle-class professionals, and their attendance at Elena's celebration represented acknowledgement that we had achieved lasting success worthy of continued respect and admiration. Mom had transformed our backyard into an outdoor reception hall with rented tents, professional lighting, and catered stations featuring traditional Mexican cuisine alongside contemporary fusion dishes that demonstrated her culinary evolution and business sophistication. The mariachi band she'd hired included musicians who regularly performed at upscale hotels and corporate events, ensuring that the entertainment would be memorable while maintaining the cultural authenticity that distinguished Vasquez family celebrations from generic party planning. Dad wore his best suit and circulated among guests with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with his role as successful patriarch, sharing stories about Elena's academic achievements and Marcus's promising medical career while accepting congratulations on raising such accomplished children who understood the importance of choosing partners who shared their values and ambitions. His pride was obvious and infectious, creating an atmosphere of celebration that reinforced the narrative about family success that had been carefully constructed over decades of strategic decision-making. The problem was Jake's presence in this carefully orchestrated celebration of everything the Vasquez family represented and aspired to achieve. While other guests clustered in animated conversation groups, sharing professional updates and family news that connected them to the broader network of successful Latino families, Jake stood awkwardly near the edges of conversations, clearly trying to participate while struggling to find common ground with people whose references and experiences seemed to exclude him from meaningful engagement. His attempts to contribute to discussions about medical school experiences, business ownership challenges, and community involvement were met with polite but brief responses that failed to develop into the kind of extended conversations that characterized other interactions throughout the evening. The disconnect wasn't malicious or deliberately cruel, but it was painfully obvious to anyone paying attention to social dynamics, rather than focusing exclusively on their own networking, opportunities, and relationship maintenance. I watched Jake's gradual withdrawal from group conversations with growing anxiety, recognizing that his quiet dignity in the face of social exclusion was being interpreted by family members as evidence of his inadequacy, rather than acknowledgement of their failure to include him in celebration rituals that should have welcomed anyone important to family members. His refusal to compete for attention or force his way into conversations where he wasn't naturally included demonstrated exactly the kind of character and emotional intelligence my family claimed to value, but they were too focused on superficial markers of success to recognize these qualities. The breaking point came during toasts celebrating Elena and Marcus's engagement, when Dad raised his glass to honor all the successful men who have joined our family, while looking directly past Jake toward other male relatives and partners whose achievements aligned with traditional definitions of professional accomplishment. The deliberate exclusion was so obvious that several guests glanced uncomfortably in Jake's direction, recognizing the social cruelty of the moment, even if they didn't understand the broader context of family disapproval. Jake's response to this public humiliation revealed depths of grace and self-control that should have impressed anyone paying attention to character rather than credentials. Instead of causing a scene or confronting Dad about the obvious slight, he quietly excused himself to help Mom in the kitchen, offering practical assistance that kept him occupied while avoiding further opportunities for public rejection. His choice to contribute rather than compete, to serve rather than demand recognition, demonstrated exactly the kind of humility and service orientation that my family preached, but apparently didn't recognize when displayed by someone whose background didn't match their expectations. The kitchen became Jake's refuge during the remainder of the celebration, where he washed dishes, arranged serving trays, and assisted with food preparation, while family members and guests enjoyed the party he was helping to facilitate behind the scenes. Mom accepted his help with the same polite appreciation she would show any willing volunteer, but without the warmth and gratitude she displayed toward family members who contributed far less effort to the event's success. My own response to watching Jake's systematic exclusion from family celebration rituals revealed how completely I had internalized the pressure to prioritize family harmony over personal loyalty, choosing to manage appearances rather than address the inappropriate behavior that was causing actual harm to someone I claimed to love. Instead of confronting Dad about his deliberately hurtful toast or insisting that Jake be included in family conversation groups, I found myself making excuses to other guests about his absence, while privately resenting him for not trying harder to integrate into social situations that were clearly designed to exclude him. The psychological pressure of maintaining this impossible balance between competing loyalties manifested in physical symptoms that should have warned me about the unsustainability of trying to serve two masters who demanded contradictory forms of allegiance. The headache that developed during the party intensified throughout the evening, creating visual disturbances and nausea that forced me to excuse myself multiple times for brief recovery periods in the house's interior rooms. Sleep became impossible that night as I replayed every moment of Jake's humiliation, while simultaneously trying to convince myself that my family's behavior was somehow justifiable, or at least understandable, given their legitimate concerns about my future happiness and social standing. The mental gymnastics required to maintain these contradictory narratives created cognitive dissonance so severe that I eventually gave up attempting to sleep and spent the early morning hours walking through our neighborhood while trying to process emotions I couldn't even name, much less resolve. Jake's behavior the following day provided another lesson in character that I was still too conflicted to appreciate fully. He didn't complain about his treatment at the party, didn't demand apologies or explanations, and didn't pressure me to choose between defending him and maintaining family relationships. His quiet acceptance of their rejection, while continuing to treat them with respect and courtesy, demonstrated emotional maturity that contrasted sharply with my own inability to handle conflict without becoming defensive and anxious. The most devastating realization, which wouldn't become clear until much later, was how completely I had failed Jake during his most vulnerable moments with my family, allowing them to treat him poorly while I focused on managing my own discomfort, rather than providing the support and defense he deserved from someone who professed to love him unconditionally. My complicity in their inappropriate behavior was perhaps more hurtful than their direct rejection, because it came from someone who supposedly understood his worth and appreciated his character. The pressure cooker atmosphere that had been building for months finally exploded 2 weeks after Elena's engagement party, when Dad requested a private conversation about my relationship with Jake and my apparent inability to recognize that I was settling for less than I deserved based on temporary infatuation that prevented me from making rational decisions about my long-term future and happiness. The phone call from Mom came on a Tuesday morning in late October, her voice carrying a level of stress I hadn't heard since the cancer scare she'd experienced 5 years earlier, when abnormal mammography results had sent our entire family into panic mode before follow-up tests revealed benign tissue changes. This time, however, the crisis wasn't medical, but financial, and the implications threatened to destroy everything my parents had built over 30 years of careful planning and strategic decision-making. "Mija, we need to talk," Mom said without her usual cheerful greeting. Her words weighted with the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent calculating impossible mathematics and searching for solutions to problems that seemed to have no acceptable answers. "Can you come to the house this weekend? Your father and I need to discuss something important with you and your siblings, and we'd rather do this in person than try to explain everything over the phone." The deliberately vague explanation was, unlike Mom's usual communication style, which typically included detailed context and practical information that helped family members prepare for whatever situations required their attention or involvement. Her reluctance to provide specifics suggested that the problem was either too complex for telephone discussion or too painful for her to articulate without the support of familiar surroundings and face-to-face comfort from the children whose success had always validated her sacrifices and justified her optimism about American possibilities. When I arrived at the Magnolia Drive house that Saturday morning, the visual evidence of their distress was immediately apparent in ways that went far beyond verbal explanations. Dad's usually immaculate lawn showed signs of neglect that would have been unthinkable during normal circumstances, with edging that needed attention and flower beds that hadn't received their customary weekly maintenance. Mom's prize-winning rose garden, typically pruned and fertilized with the precision of a botanical exhibition, displayed the kind of casual maintenance that suggested her attention had been redirected toward more pressing concerns than neighborhood beautification. Inside the house, the subtle indicators of financial stress were even more obvious to someone who had grown up surrounded by their standards for domestic perfection and social presentation. The dining room table, usually set with fresh flowers and decorative elements that created an atmosphere of prosperity and good taste, held stacks of paperwork, calculators, and the kind of manila folders that suggested serious business discussions rather than family meal preparation. The living room coffee table was covered with financial documents, bank statements, and official correspondence that created an atmosphere of crisis management rather than the relaxed family gathering space I remembered from childhood. Carlos and Elena had arrived earlier and were seated on the couch with expressions that suggested they had already received preliminary information about whatever crisis required this unprecedented family meeting. Their body language indicated a combination of concern and confusion that mirrored my own emotional state as I tried to prepare for news that could range from health problems to business failures to any number of catastrophic possibilities that might require collective family response and support. Dad's explanation of their financial situation was delivered with the clinical precision he typically reserved for business presentations, but his voice carried undertones of shame and disbelief that revealed how personally devastating this crisis felt to someone whose identity was fundamentally connected to his role as successful provider and community leader. The facts were straightforward but shocking. HEB's corporate restructuring had eliminated his position along with his pension benefits. Mom's catering business was losing clients to younger competitors with lower prices and more contemporary marketing strategies, and their accumulated savings had been depleted by a combination of business investments that hadn't performed as expected and family expenses that had seemed reasonable during periods of greater financial security. The mortgage on their beloved home, which had always represented stability and achievement rather than financial burden, had become an impossible monthly obligation that consumed nearly all of their remaining income while leaving no room for the kind of lifestyle maintenance that had characterized their previous decades of prosperity. Property taxes, insurance costs, and basic utilities created additional financial pressure that made their situation increasingly desperate despite their attempts to reduce expenses and explore alternative income sources. Mom's explanation of their attempts to resolve the crisis independently revealed both their pride and their growing desperation, as traditional solutions proved inadequate for the scope of their financial challenges. They had contacted their bank about refinancing options, only to discover that Dad's employment termination and the declining value of Mom's business made them ineligible for the kind of favorable terms they had received during previous financial transactions. Their credit rating, while still technically good, reflected the strain of recent months and made lenders hesitant to approve modifications that might have provided temporary relief. Private consultations with financial advisors had yielded recommendations that felt more like surrender than strategic planning. Selling the house and relocating to a smaller residence in a less desirable neighborhood, liquidating Mom's catering, business and seeking employment with an established company, and fundamentally restructuring their lifestyle to reflect their new economic reality, rather than maintaining appearances that their income could no longer support. The emotional impact of these recommendations was devastating for people whose identity and social standing were deeply connected to their material success and community reputation. The house on Magnolia Drive wasn't just a residence, but a symbol of everything they had achieved and a gathering place for family traditions that connected 4 generations of relatives who looked to them as examples of what was possible through hard work and determination. Mom's catering business represented 15 years of relationship building and reputation establishing that couldn't be easily transferred to a corporate employment situation that would eliminate her autonomy and creative control. The most painful aspect of their situation was the timeline pressure that made thoughtful decision-making nearly impossible. The bank had sent preliminary foreclosure notices that created a 90-day window for resolving their mortgage arrears, and Mom's business creditors were demanding payment for supplies and equipment that had been purchased during more optimistic periods when future bookings seemed guaranteed. The stress of managing these competing deadlines while maintaining appearances of normalcy during community events and family obligations had taken a visible toll on both parents' health and emotional well-being. When Dad mentioned that they were considering all available options for resolving their crisis, I heard myself suggesting that Jake might be able to provide advice or business connections that could help them explore alternatives they hadn't considered. The words came out before I had fully processed the implications of involving Jake in family financial discussions that would reveal vulnerabilities they had never shared with anyone outside their immediate circle of trust. Mom's immediate agreement surprised me, given her previous reluctance to acknowledge Jake's potential value as anything more than a temporary romantic distraction that I would eventually outgrow as my judgment matured and my priorities aligned with family expectations. "Maybe Jake knows someone in the financial industry who understands these situations," she said with desperate hope that suggested her resistance to his presence in family matters had been overcome by the urgency of their circumstances. Dad's reluctant nod indicated his willingness to accept help from any source that might provide solutions to problems that had proven resistant to their own efforts and traditional approaches. "We'll take advice from anyone who might understand how to navigate this kind of crisis," he admitted with the humility of someone whose confidence in his own financial expertise had been shattered by circumstances beyond his control. The irony of their sudden openness to Jake's potential contribution wasn't lost on me, even in the midst of processing the shocking news about their financial collapse. For 2 years, they had dismissed him as insufficiently qualified to provide meaningful insight about any subject that mattered to educated people with sophisticated understanding of complex issues. Now, facing the possible loss of everything they had worked to achieve, they were willing to consider that the mechanic might possess knowledge or connections that could help them avoid financial devastation. I agreed to ask Jake if he would be willing to review their paperwork and offer whatever assistance might be possible. knowing that his response would provide another test of his character while potentially creating an opportunity for my family to finally recognize qualities they had been too prejudiced to acknowledge. The setup felt like a perfect storm of circumstances that would either bridge the gap between Jake and my family or create even greater conflict if his efforts failed to produce the miraculous solutions they were hoping for. The afternoon that would forever change my understanding of my family, my relationship, and myself began with Jake sitting at our familiar dining room table, carefully reviewing financial documents with the same focused attention he brought to diagnosing complex, mechanical problems at his shop. The irony of the scene was almost overwhelming. The man my family had spent 2 years treating as intellectually inadequate was now their last hope for avoiding financial catastrophe, and they were watching him with desperate anticipation rather than their usual barely concealed condescension. Jake had arrived at the house that Tuesday with a leather portfolio and the kind of professional demeanor I had rarely seen him display, wearing pressed khakis and a button-down shirt that transformed his appearance from casual mechanic to serious business consultant in ways that seemed to confuse my parents, who were clearly struggling to reconcile this version of Jake with their preconceived notions about his capabilities and social position. Mom had prepared coffee and arranged the paperwork with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to client consultations, creating an atmosphere of formality that felt strange given the casual dismissal Jake had received during previous visits to our home. Dad sat across from him with uncharacteristic patience, answering questions about their financial history and business challenges without the subtle skepticism that usually accompanied any conversation involving Jake's opinions or suggestions. The transformation in my parents' behavior was remarkable, but also deeply uncomfortable, highlighting how dramatically crisis could alter their treatment of someone they had previously deemed unworthy of serious consideration. Their sudden respect for Jake's potential expertise felt less like genuine recognition of his abilities and more like desperate willingness to accept help from any available source, regardless of their previous judgments about his qualifications or social standing. Jake's examination of their mortgage documents was thorough and methodical, involving calculations and cross-references that demonstrated knowledge of financial terminology and lending practices that surprised me despite my growing awareness that he possessed depths of expertise my family had never bothered to explore. His questions about interest rates, payment histories, and refinancing options revealed understanding of real estate finance that contradicted everything my family believed about the intellectual limitations of people who worked with their hands rather than their minds. When Jake asked specifically about the original lending company and the circumstances surrounding their mortgage refinancing 5 years earlier, I watched his expression shift from professional concentration to something I couldn't immediately identify. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a momentary tightening around his eyes that suggested recognition or concern about something he had discovered in their paperwork. "Where did you originally obtain this mortgage?" Jake asked quietly, his voice carrying a tone of careful neutrality that seemed to indicate he was proceeding cautiously through territory that might prove sensitive or complicated. "The documentation shows that you refinanced through a company called Magnolia Financial Solutions, but I'm not immediately familiar with their lending practices or business model." Dad explained that they had worked with Magnolia Financial Solutions 5 years earlier when they needed capital to cover Elena's medical school expenses and help Carlos with his graduate program costs, choosing this private lending company over traditional banks because they offered more flexible terms and faster processing that met their timeline requirements. The decision had seemed logical at the time, providing access to home equity that allowed them to invest in their children's education while maintaining their lifestyle and business operations. Mom added that their experience with Magnolia Financial Solutions had been entirely positive, with professional service and communication that exceeded their expectations for a smaller company competing against major banking institutions. The loan officer had been knowledgeable and helpful, explaining options and implications with patience that made them feel valued as clients rather than processed as applications in an impersonal system. Jake's response to their explanation created a moment of silence that seemed to stretch forever. Filled with tension I couldn't understand, but could definitely feel radiating from his suddenly rigid posture and carefully controlled facial expression. When he reached for his wallet and pulled out a business card, the movement seemed to occur in slow motion. Each gesture weighted with significance that I sensed but couldn't yet comprehend. The business card he placed on the table next to their mortgage documents was crisp and professional, printed on heavy stock that spoke of quality and attention to detail. Magnolia Financial Solutions was printed across the top in elegant script, with contact information and a logo that matched exactly the paperwork spread across our dining room table. But it was the name printed below the company title that created the shockwave that would redefine everything I thought I knew about Jake, my family, and the relationship dynamics that had been tearing me apart for 2 years. Jake Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer and Founder. The silence that followed the revelation was so complete that I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking seconds that felt like hours, each tick highlighting the enormity of what we were all processing. Mom's face drained of color as she stared at the business card, then at Jake, then back at the mortgage documents that suddenly represented a connection none of us had imagined possible. Dad removed his reading glasses and cleaned them twice, a nervous habit that indicated he was struggling to process information that contradicted fundamental assumptions about reality. "You own our mortgage?" Mom's voice emerged as barely a whisper, carrying the same tone she might use to confirm a terminal diagnosis or devastating loss. The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, creating an atmosphere thick, with implications that none of us were prepared to navigate. Jake nodded slowly, his expression serious but impossibly gentle, revealing none of the triumph or satisfaction that might have been expected from someone whose expertise had been systematically dismissed and whose character had been consistently questioned by people who were now entirely dependent on his financial benevolence. "I've owned it for 18 months, he confirmed quietly. "I purchased it from First National Bank when they were selling off their residential loan portfolio to focus on commercial lending." The revelation hit me with physical force that knocked the breath from my lungs and created a sensation of vertigo that made the familiar dining room feel like foreign territory, where normal rules of gravity and logic no longer applied. For 2 years, my family had treated Jake with polite but unmistakable condescension, questioning his intelligence, dismissing his opinions, and expressing constant concern about my future security with someone whose limited education and blue-collar profession could never provide the kind of stability and success they expected for their daughter. Meanwhile, Jake had been quietly holding legal ownership of their most valuable asset, possessing the power to approve or deny their refinancing requests, to modify their payment terms, or to begin foreclosure proceedings that could destroy everything. They had worked to achieve over 3 decades of careful planning and strategic decision-making. The irony was so profound it felt like cosmic justice designed specifically to expose the hollowness of their social prejudices and the cruelty of their systematic rejection of someone whose character they had never bothered to evaluate honestly. But what devastated me even more than the stunning reversal of power dynamics was the sudden clarity about Jake's behavior throughout our relationship, understanding for the first time that his patience with their treatment hadn't been weakness or desperation for approval, but rather the quiet confidence of someone secure in his own worth and unimpressed by their attempts to diminish his value through social manipulation and emotional pressure. Every family gathering where they had ignored his contributions to conversation, every subtle insult about his career prospects and intellectual limitations, every expression of disappointment about my choice to date someone beneath their standards, had been endured by someone who possessed exactly the kind of financial success and business acumen they claimed to value above all other considerations. Jake had absorbed their criticism and rejection while literally holding their financial future in his hands, never once using his position to defend himself or expose their ignorance about his actual capabilities and achievements. The shame that washed over me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced, crushing and comprehensive in ways that made it difficult to breathe or think clearly. Not shame about Jake or our relationship, but devastating shame about my own complicity in their treatment of him, my failure to trust my own instincts about his character, and my willingness to question the most authentic love I had ever experienced, based on the narrow-minded judgments of people whose values I had allowed to override my personal happiness. I realized that while I had been struggling to defend Jake against their criticism and wondering whether their concerns about our compatibility had merit, he had been quietly testing whether I would choose our relationship over their approval. Whether I possessed the strength and conviction necessary for building a life with someone whose worth wasn't dependent on external validation or social status. My performance during this extended evaluation had been pathetic, revealing how completely I had internalized their prejudices and how little faith I actually had in my own ability to recognize character and integrity when they weren't packaged in socially acceptable credentials. As Jake began calmly explaining mortgage modification options that could save their house while reducing their monthly payments, treating them with the same respectful professionalism they had never shown him, I excused myself to the bathroom and broke down completely. The tears came in waves, each one carrying a different realization about how wrong I had been, how much damage I had allowed my family to inflict on someone who deserved nothing but my unwavering support and fierce protection from their inappropriate behavior. I cried for every family dinner where I had sat silently, while they made disparaging comments about Jake's future prospects. Every time I had apologized to him afterward, instead of confronting their behavior in the moment. Every doubt I had entertained about our relationship based on their superficial concerns, rather than trusting what I knew to be true about his character and our connection. The weight of my betrayal was overwhelming, made worse by the recognition that Jake had never needed my defense, because he was strong enough to withstand their criticism while secure in his own knowledge of his worth and capabilities. When I finally returned to the dining room, I found Jake patiently walking my parents through refinancing options with the expertise of someone who had spent years helping families navigate financial crises, his voice carrying the authority of genuine knowledge combined with the compassion of someone who understood that homes represent more than just financial investments. The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents taking notes and asking questions about payment schedules and processing timelines. Their earlier skepticism replaced by grudging recognition that they had misjudged him so completely that their error bordered on the absurd. The afternoon ended with handshakes and tentative expressions of gratitude from parents who were clearly struggling to reconcile their previous treatment of Jake with their current need for his assistance and expertise. The awkwardness was palpable, but also somehow fitting, a natural consequence of years of inappropriate behavior that couldn't be immediately erased by a single revelation about financial relationships and business ownership. That evening, as we drove back to our apartment in silence, I finally asked the question that had been burning in my mind since the afternoon's revelation. Why didn't you ever tell me about Magnolia Financial Solutions? Why did you let my family treat you like you weren't successful enough for me when you could have ended their criticism with a single business card? Jake's answer revealed depths of character and emotional intelligence that I was still discovering after 2 years of loving him. Because their approval isn't what makes our relationship real, he said simply. I didn't need to prove anything to them to know what we have together. And honestly, I wanted to see if you'd choose us even when it felt difficult, even when the people you love were making it hard. His words hit me like a revelation about the true nature of love and commitment, highlighting how completely I had misunderstood the dynamics of our relationship and the test I had been failing for months. While I had been focused on managing external approval and defending Jake against criticism he didn't need defended against, he had been evaluating my ability to stand by our relationship, independent of outside pressure and social validation. The sleepless night following Jake's revelation sent me on an archaeological expedition through our apartment, searching for evidence that would help me understand how completely I had misjudged the man I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. The journey began with his desk in our spare bedroom, a space I had always respected as his private domain, but had never examined with the curiosity and attention that now consumed me. The desk itself was a beautifully restored antique piece that Jake had found at an estate sale and spent weeks refinishing to its current state of warm mahogany perfection. I had always assumed this was simply another example of his mechanical aptitude and appreciation for quality craftsmanship, never considering that the time and resources invested in such restoration projects might indicate financial resources beyond what his automotive work could provide. The first drawer I opened contained business files organized with a precision that contradicted every assumption my family had made about his professional capabilities and administrative skills. Magnolia Financial Solutions letterhead appeared on documents dating back 5 years, revealing a company history that began shortly after Jake graduated from community college with degrees in both automotive technology and business administration, a dual focus that should have indicated broader ambitions than anyone had bothered to explore. Client correspondence filled multiple folders, each one meticulously maintained with records of loan modifications, payment restructuring, and foreclosure prevention services that had helped hundreds of families avoid the same financial catastrophe my parents were currently facing. The language in these documents was sophisticated and compassionate, combining technical expertise with genuine concern for human impact that reflected exactly the character traits I had fallen in love with but had never connected to professional success. Financial statements for Magnolia Financial Solutions revealed a business trajectory that was nothing short of remarkable, showing steady growth from a modest startup focused on helping working-class families navigate predatory lending practices, to a regional operation with millions of dollars in assets under management. The company's mission statement, written in Jake's careful handwriting, emphasized providing dignified financial solutions for families who deserve better than traditional banking institutions typically offer. Tax documents spanning the past 4 years painted a picture of personal income that exceeded my own earnings as a successful public relations professional, demolishing another pillar of my family's arguments about Jake's inability to provide financial security for our future together. The numbers weren't just adequate. They represented the kind of economic stability that should have impressed even my father's exacting standards for evaluating potential sons-in-law. Real estate holdings appeared in legal documents that revealed Jake's ownership of the building housing his automotive shop, 2 rental properties in up-and-coming Houston neighborhoods, and a small office complex that served as headquarters for Magnolia Financial Solutions. These investments demonstrated exactly the kind of long-term planning and business acumen my family claimed to value, executed by someone they had dismissed as incapable of strategic thinking or sophisticated decision-making. Educational credentials filled another folder, including not just his community college degrees, but certificates from specialized training programs in financial analysis, real estate investment, and small business management. Jake had been continuously improving his professional qualifications while my family criticized his lack of formal education, pursuing exactly the kind of lifelong learning they encouraged their own children to embrace. Professional associations and industry recognitions revealed Jake's standing within Houston's financial services community, where he served on advisory boards for community development initiatives and had received awards for innovative approaches to preventing foreclosure in low-income neighborhoods. These achievements represented the kind of civic engagement and social responsibility my parents had always identified as markers of good character and community leadership. The most devastating discovery was a folder labeled Vasquez Family, containing copies of every document related to my parents' mortgage, along with detailed analysis of their financial situation and multiple proposed solutions that went far beyond the basic loan modification Jake had presented during our family meeting. His research had included market comparisons showing how their mortgage terms compared favorably to industry standards, credit analysis that highlighted their overall financial stability despite recent setbacks, and creative restructuring options that would allow them to maintain their lifestyle while reducing their monthly obligations. Personal notes in Jake's handwriting revealed his knowledge of my family's financial crisis months before they had confided in me, along with his decision to wait for them to approach him for help, rather than revealing his ability to assist them independently. This patient approach demonstrated respect for their pride and autonomy while positioning himself to help when they were ready to accept assistance. A strategy that showed remarkable emotional intelligence and genuine concern for their dignity. Insurance documents revealed comprehensive coverage that protected not just Jake's business interests, but also his personal assets and potential future family obligations, including life insurance policies that would provide substantial financial security for dependents in case of unexpected tragedy. This level of planning contradicted my family's concerns about his ability to provide long-term stability and protection for the woman he married and the children they might have together. Banking statements showed regular charitable contributions to organizations serving working-class Latino families, including scholarship funds, small business development programs, and foreclosure prevention services that aligned perfectly with the values my family claimed to prioritize. Jake had been quietly supporting causes that should have earned their respect and admiration, while they criticized him for not understanding the importance of giving back to the community. Investment portfolios revealed diversified holdings that included both conservative instruments designed to protect principal and growth-oriented vehicles that demonstrated confidence in long-term economic expansion. The balance between security and opportunity reflected exactly the kind of financial sophistication my father had spent decades developing, executed by someone he had dismissed as financially naive and irresponsible. Business plans for expanding. Magnolia Financial Solutions included detailed market analysis, competitive positioning strategies, and projected growth scenarios that rivaled anything produced by major consulting firms. Jake's vision for his company included partnerships with community organizations, expansion into underserved markets, and innovative products designed to help working families build wealth rather than simply avoiding financial disaster. Legal. Documents revealed Jake's partnership with established law firms specializing in consumer protection and real estate law, providing his clients with comprehensive legal support that ensured they understood their rights and options throughout the lending process. These relationships demonstrated his commitment to ethical business practices and his understanding that financial services required broader expertise than any individual could provide alone. The final folder contained correspondence with other financial institutions, including major banks and credit unions that regularly referred clients to Magnolia Financial Solutions when traditional lending products couldn't meet specific family needs. These professional relationships indicated Jake's reputation within the broader financial services community and his recognition as an expert in helping families navigate complex economic challenges. Each document I reviewed added another layer to my understanding of how completely my family and I had misjudged Jake's capabilities, character, and professional standing. The man we had dismissed as an uneducated mechanic with limited prospects was actually a sophisticated business owner whose expertise exceeded that of many traditionally credentialed professionals, whose income provided substantial financial security, and whose values aligned perfectly with everything my family claimed to admire. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, creating a comprehensive picture of someone whose success had been hidden behind genuine modesty and authentic commitment to helping others rather than promoting himself. Jake's decision to maintain his automotive shop while building his financial services business reflected his appreciation for honest work and his connection to the community that had shaped his values, not an inability to envision bigger opportunities or achieve greater success. The most painful realization was recognizing how many opportunities my family and I had missed to learn about Jake's actual life and achievements because we were too focused on superficial indicators of worth and status. Every question we never asked, every assumption we made based on his appearance or choice to work with his hands, every conclusion we reached without investigating the reality of his circumstances had prevented us from seeing the remarkable person who had been patiently waiting for us to look beyond our prejudices. The avalanche of evidence forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that my family's judgment about people and situations was far less reliable than I had always believed, that their supposed wisdom about character assessment and relationship evaluation was actually narrow-minded prejudice disguised as practical concern. This revelation extended beyond Jake to encompass broader questions about their ability to evaluate any situation accurately when their perspective was limited by social biases and predetermined expectations. The morning after my discovery of Jake's business empire, I made a decision that would fundamentally alter my relationship with my family and force me to choose between their approval and my own integrity for the first time in my 29 years of life. Standing in our kitchen while Jake prepared breakfast with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything else, I realized that I could no longer participate in the charade that had been slowly destroying both our relationship and my sense of self. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever shared, marked by honesty that felt both terrifying and liberating, as I finally acknowledged the depth of my betrayal and the cowardice I had shown throughout our relationship. Jake listened without interrupting as I confessed my complicity in my family's treatment of him, my failure to defend him when he needed my support, and my willingness to question our love based on their superficial concerns rather than trusting my own experience of his character. "I've been a terrible partner," I said, the words feeling inadequate to express the magnitude of my failure. "You deserved someone who would stand up for you, who would trust her own judgment over other people's opinions, who would put our relationship first instead of trying to manage everyone else's comfort. I don't know how you stayed with someone who was so weak and disloyal." Jake's response revealed once again the depths of his character and his understanding of human nature that had allowed him to navigate my family's hostility with such grace and patience. "You weren't weak," he said quietly. "You were caught between people you loved, trying to honor competing loyalties without having to choose sides. That's not weakness, that's being human. But now you know what's really going on, and you get to decide what kind of person you want to be going forward." His refusal to punish me for my past failures while challenging me to do better in the future exemplified the emotional maturity that my family had been too prejudiced to recognize. Instead of demanding apologies or extracting promises about changed behavior, he was creating space for me to grow into the partner he had always believed I could become, even when I had given him little reason for such faith. The decision to establish boundaries with my family felt both necessary and devastating, requiring me to prioritize my relationship with Jake and my own psychological health over the family harmony that had been my highest value for nearly 3 decades. The prospect of disappointing people who had shaped my identity and provided the foundation for my understanding of love and loyalty was terrifying, but continuing to enable their inappropriate behavior felt like a betrayal of everything I actually believed about treating people with dignity and respect. I started with a phone call to my mother, requesting a family meeting where I could address their treatment of Jake and establish new expectations for how our relationship would function going forward. The conversation was awkward and tense, as Mom struggled to understand why I was suddenly making demands instead of accepting their guidance and support, as I had always done throughout my life. "We've always been close," Mom said, her voice carrying confusion and hurt that made me question whether I was making the right decision. "Why are you suddenly acting like we're the enemy? We love you, Mija. Everything we've said about Jake has been because we want you to be happy and secure. Can't you understand that our concerns come from caring about your future? Explaining that love without respect isn't really love at all, that caring expressed through criticism and judgment creates harm rather than security, required me to articulate concepts about healthy relationships that I was still learning to understand myself. The conversation revealed how completely my family had conflated their need for control with their desire to protect me, making it nearly impossible for them to recognize that their behavior was actually threatening the happiness they claimed to want for me. The family meeting that took place the following Sunday was unlike any gathering we had ever held, marked by tension and defensive behavior that replaced the comfortable routines of shared meals and casual conversation. Dad's discomfort was obvious as he struggled to reconcile his role as family patriarch with the reality that his daughter was challenging his authority and questioning his judgment about matters he considered his responsibility to evaluate and guide. My prepared statement addressed their treatment of Jake directly, acknowledging their concerns about my relationship while establishing clear boundaries about what behavior I would and wouldn't accept going forward. "I understand that you have questions about Jake's suitability as a partner," I said, reading from notes I had prepared to ensure I covered all the important points without getting sidetracked by emotional reactions. "But your concerns have been expressed through disrespect and social exclusion that's completely inappropriate regardless of your personal feelings about our relationship." The list of specific behaviors that needed to change included their subtle insults during family gatherings, their failure to include Jake in conversation and activities, their dismissive comments about his career and intelligence, and their attempts to convince me that I was settling for less than I deserved. Each item on the list was met with defensive responses and attempts to minimize the impact of behavior they characterized as minor disagreements, rather than systematic mistreatment. "We never meant to hurt anyone," Elena said, speaking for the family with the diplomatic tone she used during difficult nursing situations. "Maybe we've been too honest about our concerns, but that's because we care about Jessica's future. Isn't it better to address potential problems before they become serious issues that could affect her happiness and security?" Responding to their defensive rationalizations required me to stand firm against emotional manipulation that had been effective throughout my childhood and young adulthood, refusing to accept their characterization of cruel behavior as loving concern. "Intent doesn't erase impact," I replied, using language I had learned during workplace training about harassment and discrimination. "Jake has been nothing but respectful and kind to all of you, and he deserves the same treatment in return. Your concerns about our relationship don't justify treating him poorly." The ultimatum I delivered felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing whether there was water below, but continuing to enable their behavior while expecting different results seemed like insanity. "If you can't treat Jake with the same respect you show other family members and guests, then we won't be participating in family events where he's not welcome or where he's made to feel unwelcome," I said, my voice shaking despite my determination to follow through on this boundary regardless of their response. The silence that followed lasted several minutes, filled with shocked expressions and exchanged glances that suggested they had never considered the possibility that their treatment of Jake might have consequences for their relationship with me. The assumption that I would continue prioritizing their comfort over my partner's dignity had been so complete that they seemed genuinely surprised by my willingness to choose Jake over family approval. Carlos was the first to speak, his response revealing the family's fundamental misunderstanding of what I was asking them to do. "So you're saying that if we don't pretend to like Jake, we can't see you anymore? That seems pretty extreme, Jessica. Families disagree about things all the time without cutting each other off completely." Clarifying that I wasn't asking them to pretend anything, just to treat Jake with basic courtesy and respect, required me to explain the difference between genuine acceptance and polite behavior that allows relationships to function despite personal reservations. "You don't have to love Jake," I said. "You just have to treat him like a human being whose feelings matter. You can have private concerns about our relationship without expressing them through rudeness and exclusion." The negotiation that followed revealed how completely my family had normalized their inappropriate behavior, making it difficult for them to understand what changes were actually required to meet my relatively modest expectations for decent treatment. They seemed to believe that expressing their concerns directly rather than through subtle insults would satisfy my requirements, missing the point that their concerns themselves might be based on prejudice and misjudgment, rather than legitimate assessment of Jake's character. Dad's attempt to find middle ground demonstrated his discomfort with conflict, while revealing his continued belief that his evaluation of Jake's worthiness was more reliable than my own experience of our relationship. "What if we agree to be more careful about how we express our concerns?" he suggested. "We can work on being more diplomatic about our feelings while still being honest about our observations and worries." Rejecting this compromise required me to stand firm against their assumption that they had the right to evaluate and judge my romantic partner based on criteria that had nothing to do with how he treated me or contributed to my happiness. Your concerns are based on superficial judgments about his job and education, not on his character or how he treats me, I replied. I'm not asking you to keep your opinions to yourselves. I'm asking you to reconsider whether your opinions are fair or accurate. The meeting ended without resolution, as family members struggled to process demands that challenged fundamental assumptions about their roles in my life and their authority to influence my decisions about love and partnership. The discomfort was palpable and painful, but also necessary for breaking patterns that had been damaging our relationships for years without anyone being willing to address them directly. Leaving their house that afternoon felt like emigrating from the only country I had ever known, carrying the strange mixture of liberation and loss that accompanies any major life transition. The family that had provided the foundation for my identity and values had also been limiting my growth and happiness in ways I was only beginning to understand, making this separation both painful and essential for my continued development as an independent adult. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.